Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
This webinar will begin shortly. Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. Today we are joined by Sebastian Hess. He will be presenting Assessing and Determining Enterprise Cyber Risks. Sebastian is the second webinar in our program launch webinar series. We have another webinar tomorrow, Fran O'Hara with the 7 Deadly Sins of Scrum. You can still sign up for that and you can find the registration link over on the Huddle site. Have you downloaded our latest ebook? It is Python Scripting Essentials. That is also available for download on our Huddle site, and we will have a new ebook going out the 19th of this month. If you would like to ask Sebastian questions at any time, please submit your question in the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen, and I will allocate 10 to 15 minutes at the end of this presentation to ask Sebastian your questions. So, I will hand over to Sebastian.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining me today on this podcast. And jumping right in, I'd like to talk a little bit today about assessing and determining cyber risks. Of course, trying to discuss about the scope that is the whole enterprise is kind of complex and kind of complicated. So I thought I'd focus a little bit today on the software or system development lifecycle, just to make it more tangible and hopefully more meaningful for this audience. So what I'm going to do today is walk you a little bit through today's cyber threat landscape, and then jump right into the more technical perspective of why seems cybersecurity be so complicated, and then also looking at things that can be done to make our products and services more secure, and then also bringing it back up again a little bit toward the end on the enterprise level. How does it fit into the larger scope of enterprise risk management and cybersecurity at an enterprise level? So to jump right in, of course, cyber seems to be on everyone's minds today. it appears that trillions in dollars are the cost for cybersecurity every year due to cybercrime, due to negligence, due to all possible scenarios. And it seems to be that there's hardly any day today where there isn't a data breach or a hack in the news. So I think it's almost fair to say that cyber has become the number one, number two, and maybe even number three and number four risk that businesses face globally today. And that combined with the fact that organizations seem to be less prepared for such a big problem is kind of the underlying driver for this presentation, because it seems cyber is impacting our everyday lives almost everywhere, be it national security, be it critical infrastructures, or be it our daily lives and our normal households. So looking at the cyber threat landscape of basically where we came from just a little over 2 years ago to where we will be just a few years from now, I think it's quite obvious that the complexity of our cyber domain and the complexity of the internet, the number of users, the number of devices, the amount of data that's being stored is just increasing exponentially almost every year. So or keeping that in mind, I think it is no surprise that also the attack surface that we and every one of us offers on a daily basis is just increasing at an enormous speed. Looking a little bit at the trends that we are looking at and dealing with for this year, but also probably for the foreseeable future, I think it comes as no surprise that the Internet of Things will be the new big domain for cybercrime, for cyber threats. On one side, being devices that are used as being attacked and maybe being held ransom or being rendered useless, or also being the facilitator of an attack where a hostile takeover of a device will take place, and that then will participate in things like a denial of service attack or you name it. And that, of course, also brings us to two of the main attack mechanisms that we still see these days. On one side, it's really the denial of service attack or the distributed denial of service attack, where due to our increased dependence on IT services being available all the time, of course, it has become quite attractive to prevent businesses from actually offering their services to users and then trying to extort money from them. Or to just put them out of business due to competitive reasons or political reasons, you name it. Another aspect which was very, very prominent in the last few years, but it seems it's still very much on the forefront this year, is also ransomware, cyber extortion, where people's machines, companies' machines are just being infected by malware that encrypts their data, and therefore again offers the attacker a vehicle to extort a certain amount of money from their victims. Although it seems for a few months now that this trend has started to shift very, very slightly, because it appears that attackers found a more attractive and maybe more a certain way to make money, where the return of investment seems to be more predictable, and that's the crypto jacking, where basically they still take over the machines in the same way as they did before, but instead of encrypting the data, they will just start mining cryptocurrency in the background, and therefore basically generate value that way. And then, of course, other threats continue as well, and that's challenges that come from social engineering. You probably heard us CEO fraud or things like that. And also, of course, more and more cyber warfare, hacktivism, where cyber is becoming more and more a political domain these days. So just looking at the general threats that I just walked through. On one side, here I just have a very brief overview of what it is we actually see in real life from an insurer's perspective. So, based on all the cyber insurance claims, cyber insurance policies that are out there throughout 2013 to 2016, the AIG did a study for EMEA, just analyzing the claims that we saw. And there, of course, on looking at the right side of the screen, it comes as no surprise that industries like the financial services or communications are at the very forefront of cyber claims, just due to the fact that there's more money maybe to be made for the attackers than in other areas. But also that the trends and priorities that I mentioned earlier, looking at ransomware, seems to be validated in those claims studies, where ransomware is just the number one attack mechanism, and then it goes down to other kinds of malware and intrusion. So just taking a brief step back, if we just look at how cyber threats evolved over time, if we just look back 10, 15, maybe 20 years, it used to be pretty easy to defend yourself against attackers. You could get away with relatively weak passwords, and the scenario of a worm or a virus spreading online was very, very remote. And basically, hacking was, I don't want to necessarily say was always used for fun, but it was more used to prove a point, or it was really used from a nation state perspective. This equation really has changed a lot, where nowadays we're really dealing with the advanced persistent threat, and even the most complex passwords and good security controls are just not sufficient enough all the time to protect us. And the reason is simple. There's just a lot of money to be made from attacking systems. On the next slide, I'm just going to walk through a few slides that really give us some tangible examples of what happened in the not too distant past. And the first one I want to put up here is an example where a pacemaker was basically found to be vulnerable to remote attacks, and they actually had to do a recall, and basically have the patients that had a pacemaker being implanted go back to the hospital and receive a software update. So very, very interesting aspect from a lifecycle perspective of an, for lack of a better word, and a very, very simple maybe IoT device or embedded device. And the next one, which is also probably very well known, is a very prominent breach, data breach that happened not too long ago in the US, where one of the credit monitoring institutes got breached and lost a significant amount of personal data, social security numbers, driver's licenses, date of birth, addresses for at least 30% of the US population. And just recently, I saw the first numbers on how much that actually costs them, and you see the number here on the slide. So it seems it's quite a significant number, and that highlights, from my perspective, how important it is to have a good, secure architecture, but also to have good processes that you follow when it comes to security. Because one thing is very, very clear, at least from my perspective, there's basically new malware every day, and it's very, very hard to always be able to defend yourself against all the latest mutations and developments that are happening on the malware and on the exploit side. So having the right processes, having the right controls in place becomes more and more important. The other side of the pendulum, however, is also a quite interesting one, and it's just basically the entry barrier or the cost for criminals to get into this business of basically attacking individuals or attacking enterprises. And here I've just listed a few dollar figures of basically how cheap tools and services have become. So basically, the bottom line is almost that if you have sufficient criminal energy, almost anyone can afford getting into the business of cybercrime. And due to the fact that this ecosystem is well developed, you don't necessarily have to have any technical skills. You can just hire it all for a relatively cheap price. So looking at basically the world we live in today, trying to figure out a little bit on why are we in the situation that we are today. On the next slides, I just try to look a little bit at cybersecurity as a problem in general, and try to explain why it is so hard to get a handle on it, and also maybe in the end give a brief reason from my perspective why it actually is the way it is. So looking at cyber security and cyber attacks, I think it's always important to look at them jointly, because neither defending nor attacking happens independently from each other. It's always in the end a cat and mouse game where an attacker tries to break into a victim, an enterprise, an individual, to do certain harm, to steal data, to disrupt the service, to do whatever malicious activity. And that, of course, has to happen on a shared infrastructure. Mostly it's the internet. But the other aspect, you see that on the right, is also a quite interesting one. Basically, the success of the attacker or the victim in defending itself always depends on their own ability, and it seems there's this cat and mouse game that comes in that both sides have to have or are continually upping their game. And on the left side of the slide, you see the probably well-known cyber kill chain, and the reason why I put it there is quite simple, because from my perspective, it highlights one of the core challenges that we have when it comes to cybersecurity. And there, of course, the cyber kill chain is looked at basically coming from the perspective of the attacker. And there you see the various phases of an attack, and there are certainly other models that do similar things, that highlight other aspects or have a different focus. And the emphasis here is not to prioritize the kill chain over others. It's really just to explain the methodology, which is basically that an attacker has all the time in the world to do the reconnaissance on their targets, on who they want to attack and why, find the right ways in, find the right vulnerabilities, determine the right mechanisms to get those delivered, be it exploiting a vulnerability that hasn't been patched, be it an email attachment, being whatever, and then basically getting a foot in the door that way, all the way to the end, where they basically get control over the network and are able to achieve the actions on the objective that they want to achieve, be it disrupting a service, be it deleting data, be it stealing data, be it whatever. If you just turn this chain around, look at it from the attacked perspective, the victim's perspective, it presents quite an interesting and hard challenge, because in the end, unless you actually see the attacker executing their actions, you might not necessarily have a good idea of what's happening and why they're in their network, or that they're maybe even attacking you. So it's a very, very asymmetric equation. And switching over a little bit to the defender's side, that of course also makes it very, very hard to then defend against certain attacks, because from a defender's perspective, it's very easy to protect yourself against a malware that has a certain hash value, or an attack that's coming from a certain IP address or a certain domain name. But those are also changed very, very easily, and also maybe even almost changed on the fly these days. So protecting yourselves against those pure technical parameters is on one side easy technically, but it requires a lot of dynamic to stay to continue to be up to the challenge. And the higher you go up in the pyramid, all the way up to trying to understand basically the modus operandi of a certain attacker or attacker group, that becomes much harder. But it also is much more beneficial in the end if you manage to understand who is attacking you and why, and which tool sets they usually use, and which techniques they usually use, because it's also much harder for the attacker to change those. So getting to the top of the pyramid of pain is very, very beneficial from a defender's perspective. Now trying to bring it all together a little bit, it is the challenge to really highlight what makes cyber so difficult. And there, of course, in the beginning, or not the beginning, at the top of the slide, you have the usual thoughts that deal with risk management. So basically, from a cyber perspective, you deal with the risk of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. You put certain risk controls or security controls in place, and then basically that leaves you with a residual risk that you just have to, at a given point in time, live with. But then, of course, you have the aforementioned attackers who are trying to get into your system, and there the world becomes very, very gray very, very quickly, because at a given point in time, it's very hard to assert from certain indicators of compromise, be it a malware that you see, be it a port that has been accessed, or username password combination that has been tried, or other indicators that you can imagine. It's very hard to assert from that whether an actual attack is going on at this point, whether someone is trying to breach you, where you're just maybe in the scope of a random attack that's happening somewhere on the internet at a broad scope, and they're just trying to find victims that basically have open vulnerabilities, but you might not be impacted, or if it's an actual targeted attack against you, where someone is exclusively looking for vulnerabilities on your enterprise. And basically that gray area that I titled here with incident response is also what makes it so hard to really determine whether there has been a breach, or whether basically a breach is ongoing, or whether you're just basically successfully defending yourself. And getting to the bottom of this and doing basically the right triage and the right incident response for the right indicators that you see, that's the core of what needs to be done. And the reason why we are in this situation, from my perspective, is quite simple, and it goes kind of back to the beginning of the internet. And there, in the early 80s, basically a very powerful system was invented that allows us to share information from A to B in a very, very robust way. But back then, it really was not designed with actual security, with identity validation, or any other things in mind. It was really designed in a way to be as robust and flexible as possible. That's something that we're still basically dealing with today, and all the things we've developed since then have, in a simplified way, always been built on top of this insecure foundation. So it's very, very hard to eradicate cybersecurity problems as we see them today, due to the existing foundation that hasn't been changed in many, many years. But again, trying to just bring it back together from a risk perspective. Here, just in one slide, you just basically see again the whole idea of risk management and risk mitigation when it comes to cybersecurity. So at a given starting point in the upper left, you implement your security program, and that basically puts you in a position to have stronger risk controls and a smaller residual risk. And that, of course, is a perpetual cycle that you have to go through all the time, and also adjust to your actual threats and risks that you're facing. Now, coming to the actual core of the presentation, and that's what's probably also the most interesting to everybody here, is how does this apply to a software development lifecycle, or even to a larger extent, I would say, to a system development lifecycle. Although the focus here is certainly on software. So basically trying to figure out how can we end up with secure systems that are end-to-end secure, and maybe looking again at the internet as an unsecure, or maybe even unsecurable foundation. How can we basically end up with products and services that are coherently securing themselves without assuming that basically what's outside of them is insecure? So if we just look at the standards of software development lifecycle, I think that's known to pretty much everyone. And again, there are various life cycles that can be used. This is just one for display purposes here, because it highlights the most important and most common phases. And in the upcoming few minutes, I will look at ways how to actually get security into this life cycle. So before we actually do end up looking at the individual phases of the life cycle, I think it's worthwhile taking a very, very small detour to look at what actually is it that needs to be secured when it comes to an SDLC. And there are a lot of aspects that come into place, and that also on one side influence what needs to be secured or how things need to be secured. But also, of course, on the other side, what are the capabilities or the constraints that you're dealing with? And there, of course, I'm talking about things like which hardware is being used, which systems will this new product be developed upon or for, which technology is in place. But then also on the other side, okay, what are our cost constraints? How much budget can we maybe allocate to get security right? Do we have security aware people? Do we have security specialists on the program? But also things like, okay, what is the actual schedule here? Because getting things right might be might have schedule implications. So it becomes very, very complex very quickly, and there basically securing software is in the end not different from any other business challenges. You just have a conflicting set of interests that you need to balance in the right way. So looking at the first phase now of the SDLC from a security perspective, I think one of the most important steps at the very beginning of a product cycle is really to look at the security requirements. So basically, what are your minimum standards that you have to apply when it comes to security? Tangible examples could be things like, okay, which ciphers are being used when it comes to encryption? Which programming languages are we looking at? Are we looking at C, C++, Python, or maybe things that are more constrained? Also, which API set am I looking at? How do I want to secure my APIs if they're REST APIs, for example? Do I have requirements when it comes to two-factor authentication, when it comes to user authentications, but also things like, okay, what are my timeouts when I basically have user inactivity, or when I close a browser session? How do I want to deal with all those aspects? So setting those or defining those aspects well from a security perspective is one of the core steps that needs to be done at the very beginning of every cycle. Next, and almost equally important, of course, is then a security risk assessment. Because not every product, not every service is the same as the other, and there are certainly quite significant differences if you, for example, develop the next version of a solitaire game, or if you're working on a banking platform, or maybe in the next Facebook. So the requirements, but also the threats that you have to assume are just totally different. Be it the communication channels that are being used, be it the threats to data at rest, the threats to someone trying to exploit the user authentication, or maybe even the threats that come from you relying on other third parties because your product will be hosted somewhere in a data center that's out of your control. So basically, goal here in this phase is really to define in a very clear manner the required security controls that have to be in place. And they, of course, will vary from system to system. And simple example could be for example, a SharePoint solution, for lack of a better term, that just handles more or less news data. Maybe needs to be secured completely different compared to a solution that hosts company secrets and commercially sensitive information. So even though it's in the end the same system, because it just collects and stores data, it needs to have totally different requirements toward security and the risks of something going wrong and the system being exploited, and the negative results afterwards are just totally different. So next phase then brings us a little bit back again to the requirements definition, but it's the actual focusing on a secure architecture. So basically, now that we know what we want and what the requirements are from a business perspective, but also from a security perspective, we need to figure out how to design this service, product, software in a way that it actually is secure. So a very big focus has to be given to the architecture, because you can design and architect things in a way that are inherently secure or also inherently insecure. So spending effort on that is quite important. And then the next step or the next aspect, I think it's also a very, very important one, and that is you really have to look at how to integrate security into your SDLC environment. And there, in the headline, I listed Agile as an example, and there you need to, for example, look at abuser stories to see how basically the system that you are developing can be misused. But it basically is just symbolic for any development approach that's being taken, because the core is you have to find a way to integrate security seamlessly with whatever development approach you're taking, not to try to create a parallel universe where developers are doing one thing and then in the end you're trying to secure whatever got developed. Yes, I think it's fair to say developers are always trying to do the best job possible, but they are working under constraints, and a lot of times they're working under conflicting priorities. And if security is not a priority that's ingrained in a given program, then other priorities will just trump the security priorities, and we will end up with an insecure solution. After all the preparatory work has been done and it has been executed in a secure manner, of course, it is important to look at the product toward the end and see, okay, how were the measures that we identified in the beginning, how were the controls that we identified in the beginning, and how was the coding approach that was used being implemented? Has it been done in a secure way? So therefore, the whole aspect of security testing really becomes quite important, but also really quite complex. And on the slide itself, I listed basically two big categories: dynamic testing and static testing. But it basically spans the whole area of having defined formal test cases to really test security functionality. Basically, can you bypass authentication? Can you invoke buffer overflows that due to invalid string handling? Can you do X, Y, and Z that breaks the software? So having really formal test cases defined, not just for functionality, but also really for security, is important. But then also looking at really ways to look a little bit deeper, basically looking at the black box from the outside. Can it be broken? Looking at it from a white box perspective, maybe doing a code review. Has the code been implemented in a secure manner? Looking at string allocations, looking at preventing buffer overflows, looking at pointer handling, all those things that could be done wrong. But also then really doing a more formal, but maybe a more automated approach, looking at things like pen testing, or maybe even permanent security assessments once the product is live and in production, or maybe even in a test environment where independent parties are really trying to break it at a constant basis. But maybe even things, and this is going a little bit outside the realm of an SDLC, but seems to become more and more popular. Looking at things like bug bounties to employ the security community out there to really give your products a go and see if they can find weaknesses. Because bringing it back together in the end, one thing is true for security problems, as well as it basically is true for any change that or any problem that's being found late in a system development cycle. The later you found a problem, the more expensive and the harder it is, and therefore the more costly it is to fix it. So you have basically every incentive to get security right, because we're in a world today now where it is fair to assume that if it can be breached and broken or exploited, it will be. It's just a matter of time. And I want to continue with actually a few examples on just trying to visualize very, very easily why this is so important, why this can become quite costly very, very quickly. And I'm just focusing here on one example, basically a product vulnerability in IoT device. It could maybe even be our pacemaker that we talked about earlier. And there, basically, a vulnerability has been found that needs to be fixed. So basically, a patch is developed that is easy to do. It takes us 5 man days to do that. Then we want to make sure that we didn't break anything, that it works as expected. So it takes us another 5 man days to test the thing. So basically, overall costs not too much. But then we are now in a situation where this is actually a device that has been deployed throughout Europe, for example. There are about 1 million customers that use that this device that has a remotely exploitable vulnerability. So we need to notify all those customers that there's something wrong with their product and we want to fix it. Because for whatever reason, we cannot do an over-the-air update, which of course would be a nice thing to do. So all of a sudden, we have to look at 500,000 euros just in notification costs to reach our customers. And then, of course, we still haven't fixed the problem. We still need to fix the problem. So we do a recall, we do the update. So just a very conservative approach here. We have 1 million devices that need to be fixed because there are 1 million customers and it can cost us about 10 euros per device. So we end up with a cost of 10 million. So overall, the cost of 10.5 million euros just to fix a remotely exploitable vulnerability in an IoT device. And then to really highlight the point I'm trying to make is we're looking now at the same device just maybe a month later, and a new vulnerability has been found, again remotely exploitable. So all of a sudden we're looking at the same costs again, and this could be a vicious cycle that is very, very hard to escape, because once a product is out of the door, again, as we've seen earlier, it is very, very costly and expensive to fix things. So with those two very simple examples, I just wanted to hopefully highlight very, very briefly, but also clearly how important it is to get this right. Of course, we could have a completely independent webinar on the whole topic of risk quantification. How much does it cost? Or what are certain cyber risks? What are the costs associated with certain cyber risks? What is the effectiveness of individual controls versus other controls? But that would be a webinar in itself. So I just want to stick with those two simple examples here, just to highlight the fact how important it is to get this right. So basically, coming back to our SDLC that I've shown previously, it really comes down to making sure that we turn our SDLC into a secure SDLC, doing the right security measures, steps at each of the phases. Because in the end, what we want to is we need to get away from security as an afterthought and ensure that we have security throughout the life cycle. And that in today's world also has to include a situation where we are able to react to vulnerabilities that have been found and be able to fix them in a preferably remote manner, but maybe also with other means. So taking a step back slowly, it is therefore really important to really look at cybersecurity from a larger perspective. So once your product is in place and operational, or your software or your service, it really gets embedded into the whole ecosystem of cybersecurity. And there it has to play well with the existing security organization that you have. It needs to be embedded in all the operational security processes. And it needs to, of course, play well with the security technologies that are in place. Because once a product is up and running, you still need to look at things, for example, like fraudulent use. You might need to monitor certain things against abuse. And you also, of course, need to be sure that maybe your product isn't used to exploit a different service that's also running in the same environment. So it gets very, very complex very, very quickly. And here, just to take the final step back, it really then needs to get embedded in the whole ecosystem that is cyber risk management, which deals with compliance, which deals with privacy aspects, which deals with really IT security at its core. And there, it is important to really determine what is the right level of security. How much security is basically okay versus what is too much security when it comes to cost explosions, when it comes to trying to mitigate risk a little bit more, but investing a lot more money really doesn't bring much benefit anymore. So trying to find the right equation and trying to define the right risk appetite for a given product is quite important, because one thing is clear, and I think we see that every day in the news, it is impossible to have perfect security, so it will always stay a risk-based discussion. So defining security controls, but also defining security steps in your processes, in particular in your software development lifecycle processes, is key, because you don't want to overdo it, but you also don't want to be caught with your pants down. So coming to the end, there are really just a few takeaways, and you can read them here on the slides. It really comes down to a few facts, that security and the services, products that we are dealing with today and that we're using on a day-to-day basis are heavily intertwined. So it's very, very hard to look at them in isolation, and therefore it becomes more and more important that basically a given service, a given product has a secure foundation and is securable. And that, of course, requires that security, as I mentioned before, is not done as an afterthought. And also, I mentioned before that we are prepared to deal with a situation when a new vulnerability has been found and needs to be remediated. And with those words, I'm actually at the end of my short presentation, and I'm handing it over for questions.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. That was very interesting, and we will get to the Q&A in just a moment. I will just remind everybody that they can still ask Sebastian a question. You can submit in the question box there on the right-hand side of your screen. We have 3 new webinars up on our Huddle site for you to register for: Testing and DevOps, Pattern for Automation Greatness, and I Am Groot, Learning Agile Testing. We are ending our team discount, so you can get 3 tickets with 2 free, and that is ending on Wednesday the 18th. So there's still time to get those tickets. So I will get on to the Q&A. First question: what are the objects that should be included in a good penetration testing report?
Okay, the objects that should be included from my perspective are really looking at it from a basically white box perspective. What is the functionality that actually is available, and how could it be exploited? So really trying to break the system. That's one of the list of objects. So really basically, does it work as it's intended to work? And then on a more from a more black box perspective, basically where were we able, or how were we able to break the product? Have we been able to do a buffer overflow? Have we been able to do cross-site scripting? And basically highlighting all those areas where vulnerabilities and broken functionality have been identified. And then, of course, or were identified. And then, of course, combining those objects also with some sort of severity rating on how critical it is to actually find them, fix them. Okay. And I think one final step I think would be very, very useful, but that requires a lot of knowledge from the penetration tester, that is basically how could those individual findings potentially be combined to break a system even more effectively. So are there connections between the individual findings that they have?
Okay. Can we predict cyber crime rather than simply respond to it?
I think yes, it can be predicted to a certain degree. And the reason why I say that is previously I worked in the finance sector, and there it was perfectly possible to track threat actors on what they're doing on a global scale. And you could almost predict the time when they're focusing on a new country, when they're basically, for example, done with the Netherlands and then we're moving over to Belgium. So to a certain extent, it can be done. And it might even be possible to do that on an individual or on an enterprise level, but you need to have the right intelligence. And it's one of those unknown unknowns sometimes that it's hard to look for until you know what it is you need to be looking for. So I don't think it is absolutely possible, but I do believe there are quite a few situations where you can at least predict and anticipate certain threat actors that are already known and already basically on someone's radar.
Okay. Is there still a risk using public Wi-Fi?
Yes, I think there is. And the reason is relatively simple from my perspective. Wi-Fi protocols are proprietary protocols, so there hasn't been any independent validation by security researchers, by experts, to really poke at them and determine whether they are secure to the best of our knowledge. And the past has shown that there were always vulnerabilities that have been found in each of the standards. So it might as well be that there are vulnerabilities that just are not publicly known yet, or that they will be found in the future, due to the fact again that this is a closed standard that hasn't been independently validated.
Okay. What cyber threat concerns you the most?
I would say it's mostly the, now working in insurance, the threat of business interruption, due to the fact that this is something that gets very, very costly very quickly. And perfect example is the big shipping company that was in the news throughout last year, where they basically, due to a ransomware attack, they lost 400 million in more or less business interruption, due to the fact that they couldn't ship goods from A to B.
Okay.
So that is from my perspective the biggest threat.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Where should the power and responsibility of national governments begin and end in cyberspace?
I would say that is probably a very, very loaded question, because I think it really depends a lot on national identities and on the way how government is seen as a public role, whether it is, for example, more a US approach where the government is there to basically support the people and leave them alone as much as possible, for lack of a better word, or whether it's more the European approach where the government is seen as a very useful helping hand. And I think that political discussion drives a lot the discussion on how the governments need to position themselves excuse me, when it comes to cyberspace. Challenge, of course, is that the well-established paradigms that we know when it comes to territory and sovereignty are just not really that present in cyberspace. So trying to have a different rule set where different governments are imposing different rules or different approaches is becoming more and more difficult. And we see that certain countries certainly try to a large extent to encapsulate the environment, be it North Korea, be it China. But I think this is something that becomes more and more difficult over the years. But it will also become one of those things that need to be answered because that's just something that's too important when it comes to running our daily lives, to not have clear answers on what it means in a given country operating in cyberspace.
Okay, perfect. How many times a week should I test my cyber threat incident plan?
I would say that depends on your size of organization, on your requirements when it comes to availability and uptime, and also I would say based on previous results. So basically, if you have a plan and you know your teams are working perfectly within that plan and it's a well-oiled machine, there might be less need to test the plans than if something just went completely wrong. I think what has become an almost reality is that incidents in cyber happen on a day-to-day basis. So it from my perspective doesn't become so much of a challenge of not being able to test your plans and your processes. It's really finding the right thresholds between an incident and a major incident, for example, or a major incident that could also be a business crisis, and then basically really invoking those certain parameters that really test those individual functions. For example, a crisis team, whether your crisis team is able to do the right things at the right time under time pressure, whether everyone knows that they're in a crisis team, who needs to be in there, and things like that. So I think a constant testing approach is important, but you need to find the balance between useful testing and overdoing it and people just starting to ignore. And a perfect example from my perspective is a lot of companies have, when you log into your Windows box, they have disclaimers that tell you things that you're allowed to do and not allowed to do. I would bet that 95% of the people have never read them because they're just constantly there and they're just nagging you all the time. So you just start to ignore them. And when it comes to testing your plans and procedures, it's like that. You need to find the right balance, and that is something that needs to be determined for the individual enterprise, because it's mostly a human factor in the end that comes to play.
Yeah, absolutely. What is the difference between threat, vulnerability, and a risk?
Okay. A threat, in my world, is something that might happen to you or not. For example, in the real world, if you live in California, there's always the threat that there might be an earthquake, for example. So this is just an adverse event that could happen. A vulnerability is without using a word again, a weakness in a system that is just there, and it can be exploited. It might never be exploited, might never be found, but it's just a state that the system is in, basically where there is something broken that could get exploited at one point. And the risk is more or less well, not more or less. In the end, risk is the combination of likelihood and probability. So basically, it comes down to how likely is it that a certain threat is happening or is materializing, and there it then quickly takes things into consideration, looking, for example, at a given vulnerability or of a set of vulnerabilities. If a certain threat can be exploited by using or invoked by using a given vulnerability, is it well known that it exists? Is it well known that you are vulnerable to it, and things like that? So the risk in the end is your personal position on the map when it comes to how likely is it that something bad will happen to you.
Okay. Do you prefer filtered ports or closed ports on your firewall?
Well, I would say from a firewall perspective, I think a good starting point is to close as many ports as possible. And I think from the pure RFC perspective, it's probably the right thing to do to have closed ports, and then basically if someone comes, they tell you, well, this port is closed, no service there. I think in today's world, stealth becomes more and more important due to the fact that once an attacker knows that someone is there, they can start trying to find the weakness and the vulnerability. If they don't know that someone is behind a certain IP, they just might move on. So even though it's technically outside of the standard, when it comes to the RFCs of how the internet should work, I think there's a lot of value in stealth.
Okay, so last question, Sebastian. What are the first 3 steps when securing a server?
I would say the first 3 steps when securing a server are definitely starting with the latest patched version of software that's available across the board. Then applying a very strong security baseline that really defines which services should be running, shouldn't be running, what should be open, what shouldn't be open, things like that. And then the third aspect is bringing that server into your, I assume it exists, security monitoring environment. That basically, if something happens to that server, that you really will know that something is happening. So those are, from my perspective, the 3 first steps.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And thank you so much today, Sebastian, for your time and your webinar. We really appreciate it. You can tune into our last webinar in the webinar series tomorrow with Fran O'Hara. Thank you again, Sebastian.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.